good day to you, Guyana, and welcome to Facing the Nation. Not only good day to you, but Happy New Year. I know some people have completed their New Year greetings, but since this is the first time for 2016 that I am seeing you, I'm going to say Happy New Year to you, and I wish you all the wonderful things that you wish yourselves actually, in this our New Year. As you know, we didn't have Facing the Nation for the last 2 weeks because on the 25th of December was Christmas Day. We don't have Facing the Nation on holidays, and of course, the 1st of January was also a Friday, so we were out for those days. But it's very good to be back and to start off the new year on a very, very informative note. Today's program, as usual, promises to be informative. Two major topics today. The first one, even though they will not be discussed in this order, the first one has to do with constitutional reform, the importance of it, why it's important to Guyana at this time, and for that, the convener of the steering committee on constitutional reform, Mr. Nigel Hughes. He is also an AFC executive member and an attorney at law. He's in studios with us to talk about that and talk about some other things that he has made some statements on. So it'd be good to hear from Mr. Nigel Hughes today. Also, as you know, there is a ban that is going to be instituted on styrofoam. The ban, in a sense, has already been instituted, but there's been a grace period for persons to be able to adapt and so on. So to talk about that, I have Mr. Khemraj Parsram, and he is the Director of Compliance and Enforcement of the EPA, and of course, EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency. So he's here to talk about that. How ready are we for this ban on styrofoam and some other things as it has to do with the environment? So I'll get right into today's discussion and welcome Mr. Khemraj Parsram. Welcome to Facing the Nation, sir.
Thank you very much, Malika. Thank you for having me, and good day, Guyana, and Happy New Year as well, and a prosperous 2016.
It is wonderful to have you in studio, sir. First off, let's talk about the environment as it relates to the ban on styrofoam. Really and truly, what will it do for Guyana, a ban on styrofoam at this time?
All right. The ban on styrofoam, as you know, it came into effect on January 1st this year, 2016. I will give you a little bit of history of that. For some time now, the Environmental Protection Agency has been working with this regulation to put it forward because there were many issues that you would notice and very visible in our environment is the proliferation of garbage in our drains and among our streets and so on. And styrofoam was one of the major contributor, not the only, but it was one of the major contributor. And the fact that styrofoam has, or polystyrene, where we commonly know it as styrofoam, there are alternatives to styrofoam, apart from the other aspects like the PET bottles or the plastic bottles. There are readily available alternatives to these styrofoam packaging or food packaging. The ban focuses mainly on the food items, the foodware, the plates, the cups, the clamshell boxes, and so on. And so the intention was now to, because of the alternatives being available, is to promote those alternatives. The styrofoam, as you would say, it's probably about 2 to 5% of the garbage that is being produced in the municipality of Georgetown alone. This has not been checked across the country. That is the data. And so with that proliferation...
So there is evidence, sorry.
Yes, there is,
okay.
And you can see it daily as you go along as a common citizen. But the fact that it's because we have the alternative, it's best for us to go with the low-hanging fruit and deal with the styrofoam ban on the food service industry. As we go along, I'm sure I'll explain a little bit more on what how we plan to implement it, and so on.
Have there been, or can we expect more public information, public announcements on the ban? And from your work and probably assessing things, especially our food vendors and so on, are they ready for it in terms of getting rid of old stock and preparing for the changeover?
All right. The information I'm getting and from the public, from the feedback and so on, is that they welcome the ban. However, their concerns are mainly focused on the cost and what type of alternatives. So yes, we have implemented the ban, and just to let it clear, the ban is really right now on the importation and the sale or use of food items, foodware. Let me just basically describe or give the definition for what the food service provider or product means. It means a food container, plate, hot and cold beverage, cup, meat and vegetable trays, egg carton, and any other product made of expanded polystyrene and used for selling and providing for prepared food or consumption on and off a food service establishment. So that basically is focusing on the food products, prepared food products, cups, plates, and so on. Now, leading up to the ban, there was several consultation where we have met with the importers and the general public and speak about their concerns and so on. What we plan to do now with the ban on importation, so it's no longer allowed as of 1st of January.
Okay.
What we're doing now in the first 3 months is preparing the populace and the importers, the vendors, on what are the alternatives. So right now we are actually engaging the IAST and the Guyana National Bureau of Standard to develop a standard for the alternatives.
Okay.
What are the basic components are we expecting to be comprised in these products or these alternative products that we want to promote? There are many out there. There's cornstarch, there's bagasse, made products that are 100% biodegradable. In fact, some of the local distributors already have started bringing in some of those products.
Yes, we've seen it.
And they have, some of the restaurants have started to utilize these things. They are concerned about the strength of these things in terms of the use of the various type of food. For example, soups or liquids, they tend to get messy and leak and that sort of thing. So right now we're working with these two organizations to come up with the best sort of standard on what works. What we want to also do, sorry Malika,
That's okay.
what we want to do is to have the current local distributors to work with the food vendors in terms of testing out these products.
Okay.
A suggestion is what? Let's probably give out a few of these various type of boxes for the various type of food products and let them test it out to see how well it works in the meanwhile. So that gives us the opportunity to say, okay, you know what, it gives a little bit comfort to the vendors themselves, and it allows for, being clear and tested in terms of what product actually works.
I don't know if you have a responsibility to be concerned about this, but what about affordability? Because that may become an issue. Have you done a survey to see if it's more expensive or less expensive than the Styrofoam?
Yeah, actually we have done some work, but from at the international level, we find that the typical alternatives are between 10 to 20 cents US, a bit more per item, all right? We have not done it here locally in Guyana, but as I said, as part of this plan over the next 3 months, is that the agency is working in terms of doing sort of a willingness to pay survey in terms of what it will cost, what people are willing to pay in addition to the going to this alternative as well. We're also looking to do the survey in terms of what is being resale, what it costs locally, and have a list of prices at the international level where people import these from. So in the U.S., I know in California, there are a number of establishments there that provides these alternatives. So we look at the prices there. We'll work with the business community to see where we can, look at other opportunities in terms of other market incentives that we can apply and recommend to government to institute, for example, tax subsidies and so on, so they reduce the cost of bringing in the product, and then as well work with the others in terms of reducing the cost, and so all these things are a combination of actually working the cost. It's not clear as yet, but we are working in that process to get it done and tidy up.
This may be a stretch, but do you, especially in your field, in your area of work, would we ever see such a ban on plastic, as in specifically plastic bottles? Because I was having a discussion with a colleague earlier, and she was even concerned about that. Yes, the same way we would see the Styrofoam, the boxes swimming in the drains, we would see the plastic bottles. can that possibly happen? Because I was explaining to her, that's plastic. You use plastic for so many things. Is it possible?
Well, as I mentioned before, we targeted styrofoam because it was basically the low-hanging fruit. All right. They are out there, what they say, biodegradable plastics and so on. So we want to take it a step at a time. It is
Okay.
possible, and we will move in that direction, I suspect. But we can deal with the styrofoam because that's the fastest
Easier.
and easier one to do. So yes, and to answer your question, we can go that line in terms of plastics as well.
All right.
Right.
I'm not sure if you are much into law enforcement as it relates to this. In the event that after the time, the allotted time would have elapsed and customers, vendors, whoever are found using these styrofoam products, what is the possible penalty, if you can say, at this point?
All right. The regulations provide for $50,000 for someone who was between $50,000 and $100,000 for any breach of these regulations, offering for sale or importation.
Okay.
That's the fee, not less than $50,000 or $100,000. All right. So that is basically the fee. However, we will work with people in terms of, we notice, I mean, there's a grace period of 3 months. The whole idea of that 3 months is for people to sell out what they have,
What they
they've
have.
brought in and utilize. Yes, it may not, all may not be, may go within that 3 months, but we will review it as we go along to see what best is there. And then if somebody's in breach, then we'll apply the breach. So in essence, what I'm saying is that enforcement will be phased,
Okay.
all right?
It's not rash.
It's not rush. So we want to work with you. We want to work with the importers. We want to work with the food vendors to ensure that what they have. So we'll do an audit, basically, of what exists in the country.
Yes, I was about to ask if you were going to be
Exactly.
going around to businesses to see who has what.
Exactly. So I mean, a little tedious, but we'll have to do
Yes.
it and make sure we get an understanding of what we have in country so that we can look at, okay, how we can phase this out. All right. For now, it's 3 months. So we have a lot of work to do, and we're pushing to get that done. So then the enforcement, as I said, the enforcement will come on a phased basis. We look at the importers right now. So GRA will know that coming in after this 1st of January, no further importation except what has been declared,
Declared, yeah.
on the 31st of December 2015.
So as it is now, we're not taking any in. We're not bringing any.
No,
So
no.
that
That's
that
where the
period
ban.
should expire in March, because if it's the 3 months grace period.
The- all the items or declarations made on the 31st of December will be honored by GRA.
Will be honored. Okay.
Right? Anything after that will not be
Well,
honored
okay, I
by
understand.
GRA. So that's where, in terms of importation.
Finally, before we come off of the issue of styrofoam, because I want to talk about some other quickly
Sure.
some other environmental matters with you. You did say earlier that you would be, especially with business persons, testing the products, the alternative products, and so is there a format or a procedure in place whereby after testing with business persons and other vendors and so on, is there a process whereby the public will be, in a sense, briefed on, which materials we've decided to use and which is better
Yeah.
and so on, in a formal sense?
Yeah. Well, Malika, the whole effort here is basically the awareness and educating the public and the people that matters or who utilize these things. One, the importers, the vendors who resell it, and the consumers as well. So this testing of the product is more geared for the vendors.
Okay.
So we will develop a series of, information packages. We will go out and meeting with these vendors and try to promote. Not a brand as such, because we
Yes.
don't want to promote a brand.
Got
But
you.
what we want to promote is what we consider as the basic constituent that is suitable. At this point in time, in my opinion, it's 100% biodegradable. Once it's plant-based, bagasse, cornstarch, or anything like that, it's fine with us.
Okay.
Again, what we want to see is the durability of the product in terms of the various food types.
All right, great. Viewers, if you're now tuning in, this is Facing the Nation, our first edition for the year 2016. I am currently speaking with Mr. Khemraj Parsram. He is the Director of Compliance and Enforcement at the EPA. Coming up a little later on, I'll be talking about constitutional reform with Mr. Nigel Hughes. But before that, I know Mr. Parsram will address some other environmental issues. One of the things we're seeing is a big cleanup campaign in our city. How has the EPA contributed to that?
Okay. All right. For the EPA has been working on this matter for some time as well. As you would recall or know, we have our 2013 our litter prevention regulations that came into force in 2013, and we actually hired a cadre of litter wardens, which we have trained, and they have started working in Georgetown in mid 2014, I would say. So in essence, EPA and its litter enforcement program actually was a feed up or a lead up to this big cleanup campaign that we had. Actually, we've been working with the mayor and city council since then and seeing how best we can start the cleanup process. Actually, what we have done was to go at these illegal dump sites that we've had, and I can name some of them. There were some in Border Market. When you had problems there, and Starbrook Market, there were a lot of dumps there. Around that vicinity, there were a lot of dumps there. And so we've investigated and tried to find out who were the culprits really illegal dumping there, and advised the mayor and city council as to our findings and so on and how to work with it. So, and we also have been on social media promoting the need for a clean and green city. We've also started working with communities to establish green spaces.
Yes.
And get community involvement in green spaces. So everything that we had started, it wasn't that big, but it fed into this wider program of the mayor and city council that was started in 2015 and following the president's vision for a clean and green Guyana.
Okay. Apart from that, what we've talked about the styrofoam ban, and you did just talk about the clean and green and contributing into what, because it is not until something happens then I think people remember there is an agency such as the Environmental Protection Agency. How really do you function, and what are some of the things people can contact you for? What really is the role of the EPA?
All right. Well, the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, has one major function. Is to protect the environment and human health and conserve biodiversity, basically. That's, in a nutshell, what it is. We have 4 divisions, 3 main technical divisions, which is one is the Education, Information, and Training Division that deals with educating the schools and the school children and so on, and the general populace about environmental matters and how to, for example, conserve and recycle and these kind of things. Then we have the Permitting Division. That division actually permits development activities, and all development activities, spray paint shops, forestry, mining, chicken farming, sand mining, for example, all these type of activities have to be authorized by the agency first. Actually, the agency is the one that should give first development consent before they go to the various other places to get their approval.
So in actuality, we're supposed to be contacting the EPA first.
Exactly.
Okay. I don't
So
think
for example, if somebody wants to do a logging concession, yes, they will get the permission to use this area, proposed area, but they have to also check with EPA to get their permit to log.
Okay.
Right? So it's a collaboration between the EPA and the other sectors as well. There is the Compliance and Enforcement Division, which I am the director of.
Yes.
It's a pretty new division, started in late 2013, but became fully functional in 2014. And what we do is there are 2 types. We respond to reports of pollution, what we call complaints. So we get a lot of complaints about noise, about dust, about fumes, and so on. So we have a team that would investigate these, and we'll provide recommendation through our compliance initiatives.
If I can just jump in
Sure.
here, if someone calls to say that, I don't know, what it be, a mechanic is close by disrupting the rest or dust, you did just mention dust, and you go there and you discover that it is true, what would be your next move? Because there are some cases where people would actually call into this very program and complain about those kinds of things. They would say that they went to the EPA, somebody visited or somebody just didn't visit, but even though the complaints were registered, the person is still, in a sense, for want of a better word, a nuisance to them. How do you deal with stuff like that?
Right. Well, we get those on a daily basis. So as I said, the first once we receive a complaint, a report, we'll look at the risk. There are some cases where, okay, is a serious threat to environment or a serious threat to human health, we'll quickly go and deal with it. If it's not, somebody, so in essence what I'm saying there is high risk, medium risk, and low risk. So we categorize it because there are numerous. You can understand the amount that will come in on a daily basis. So we'll do an investigation based on risk. We'll target those, and we find out, for example, let me use an example. An example is probably the best thing to use. Somebody complained about furniture manufacturing along the East Coast, and they say that dust is impacting on them. That is, in my understanding, it's probably high to medium to high risk because of the dust. Okay. All right? So the officers will go and we'll look and see where it is, see where it's coming from, and we'll recommend to the furniture manufacturer, okay, you probably have to enclose your operation because if it's not enclosed, then dust escapes into the environment. You probably have to have a dust collection system. So from your saws or whatnot, it feeds into a dust collection system. And we give people a period of time to comply, typically a month, for them to build, construct all this stuff and so on.
Have you ever had to get the law enforcement, police involved?
In some cases, we have utilized the police force to go in and mainly noise issues and so on. Like I said, we do not want to shut down people's businesses.
Yes,
right?
that is not the intention.
The Environmental Protection Act came in 1996. So anything prior to 1996 that was established, we have to work with them. And as we go along, it's been 20 years, but we don't know of every single crook and cranny where these small bottom house operations started. And now they've expanded into big things. So only when people report, then we know where these are. So we'll go after them and we try to ensure, okay, Lord, come. So we give you a warning, we give you some recommendations. When you don't abide by those recommendations, we then have no alternative to take you for an injunction in the courts. And just to mention, that's a long process as well. We have many of those cases in court.
Pending.
And then people get worried and so on, what the EPA is not doing anything. But it's the court that is, the time, the lawyers find an answer to our request for an injunction, and it goes back and forth. What we have done is we're making recommendations in terms of we've developed what we call compliance and enforcement regulations. That gives us for us to apply civil and administrative penalties without going to the courts.
And this is basically new. This is new to EPA.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we can go in and seize people's equipment. We can go in and offer for them to pay back on the cost or the damages caused and so on, without having the court to decide on it. Only on serious criminal cases we'll allow the court to deal with.
Okay.
So this should coming over the next during this course of this year, and hopefully that will help.
But I hope to have you back then to talk about that. Finally, before I have to let you go, you did just say that some of these cases, some people start their businesses as bottom house operations and then they grow, and you would only know, your organization, your agency would only know until someone complained. Is there, I don't know how difficult this is there any measure in the EPA where you can, in a sense, implement or create preventative measures for some of these possible things that would spring up? Not only for people operating nuisance businesses, but like for garbage dumping and so. Are there any preventative measures?
Well, the two major preventative measures that we use, one is what you call the carrot and stick approach. The stick is you have to be registered with the agency. You have to apply for an authorization, an environmental permit. Anything that is new, any development activities. So you have to go through an EISI, and if it's a large forestry or mining activities, you have to go through an environmental impact assessment. That predicts the impacts, possible impacts from this type of activity. So once it predicts it, then we know what will be the impacts, and we can then apply the recommendations or the mitigation measures up front, preventing that from happening. So ensuring that whoever is developing this mining activity, ensure that there is mitigation plan and measures to prevent pollution of the environment. And the other aspect is our compliance. Those that are existing, we go out and work with communities. People may not know. A lot of people don't know about what they do, especially small bottom house activities. So that unit go along and say, okay, what can I help you with? What do you need help? What do you need help with in terms of, because they would not know. So we'll provide a recommendation and work with them to comply and come into compliance with the regulations.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you very much, sir. I know your contribution today was very, very enlightening, and I think sometimes we get lost in the regular stuff that we do every day, and the regular topics and so on. So people really forget what the purpose is regarding some agencies and so on. So I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Facing the Nation, and I look forward to having you back when you get to the new regulations and so on up and running.
Yeah.
All right. Viewers, of course, if you're now joining us, you've missed a really good conversation. Of course, I was talking to Mr. Khemraj Parsram. He is the Director of Compliance and Enforcement at the Environmental Protection Agency. On the other side of this very quick break, I'll be talking about constitutional reform. Stay with Facing the Nation. Thank you very much for staying with Facing the Nation. I did promise you earlier two very informative issues today, two very informative topics, and now we move on to constitutional reform. Of course, there's been much talk about that, especially since the new, which is still relatively a new government, since the new government took office, about the importance of it and all of that. And it's my pleasure for the first time to have Mr. Nigel Hughes. He's no stranger to Guyana, no stranger to my viewers, because I know you look at other things. Mr. Nigel Hughes is an executive member in the Alliance for Change, AFC, by extension making him also a member of our current government. He is an attorney at law, and he is the convener for the Steering Committee on Constitutional Reform. Just so you can get a bit of background for those of you who have not been paying much attention to constitutional reform, and I'm reading this from a very accurate report. The Prime Minister, that's Prime Minister Moses Nagamotu, had appointed Mr. Hughes as the convener and had also appointed Professor Harold Lachman, Mr. Haslin Paris, Ms. Geeta Chandan Edmond, and Mr. Gino Passad as members of the committee, that's the Committee on Constitutional Reform in August. That committee was tasked with setting up the framework for a substantive constitutional reform body intended to be broad-based and inclusive of all major stakeholders. And it is my pleasure to have in this case, I'm going to call him the expert on it, to have him and to welcome you to Facing the Nation, sir. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I just want one correction. I'm not a member of the government at all.
Okay.
So you did say that I'm not
a member of the government, even though I said it by extension. All right.
The Alliance for Change is
enough.
part of the governing alliance.
Just the alliance, but you're...
Personally, I'm not, no.
Okay, okay, good. Member of the Alliance for Change. I stand corrected on that. Let's talk constitutional reform. Why is constitutional reform important to Guyana at this time?
You're limiting that to this time. I think, Malika, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. Since independence, Guyana has been dogged by issues of governance and the distribution of power, because we've had a history where our peoples have not been united. We've been we've been separated on various issues, race, ethnicity, other issues. And because we inherited, in essence, what was a British model for their colonies, without that model for governance being driven by our circumstances, we took the Westminster system. What that led to was a series of abuses and dominance, and if you changed government, we've only changed government twice since 1966, which is unusual in the Commonwealth Caribbean and particularly unusual in the Caribbean. And that change came in 92, and then we had one government in 64, became independent in 66, we changed in 92, and then we changed again in 2015. And if you were not on the governing side of the party that was in power, invariably people felt excluded from the decision-making processes of the state. And because our political history, invariably the two principal parties that existed before 2005 drew their support from principally ethnic groups, it translated into various groups feeling excluded from the decision-making processes of the state. And a lot of that goes back to the way the country is structured and the way the Constitution is structured. And until we get that right so that everybody feels as if they're consulted and they participate in the decision-making process, you will continue to have the creation of the feeling of alienation by various groups in the society. And that's why I think there was a big effort in 1997 arising out of the election results and people's disquiet about what happened in the election results. There was a big push for constitutional reform. It came out of the St. Lucia's Statement, the Herdmanson Accord and the St. Lucia's Statement. They had that process. There were recommendations made in 1999. A lot of those recommendations have not been implemented yet. For example, the Human Rights Commission has never been established. And those recommendations had their birth in the fact that people felt alienated and felt that they had no role to play in the system. And so I think generally what happened was that constitutional reform became a big issue for the opposition in the last election, because they realized that even though you might have had a regime that had certain frailties, there was also a structural problem in the society as to how we manage ourselves or govern ourselves. And it's in that context that constitutional reform, I think, became relevant, and the Prime Minister appointed a steering committee to advise him on how the constitutional reform process should go and how that should be peopled and how it should take place.
I know you handed over a report to him at the end of last year, at the end of 2015. Are you in a position to make anything regarding that report public at this time and the outcome of the consultations?
First thing, the report I handed over was an interim report because we didn't have enough time or resources to complete what we wanted to do or the terms of reference. I think it would be inappropriate for me to disclose the content of that report because the Prime Minister did assign us the task of advising him. We've only shared that with him on the 31st of December, which is the last day. And I don't think it would be appropriate for me to share the content of that. Really, if the Prime Minister were to speak about it, or if the Prime Minister were to say to the committee, you are free to discuss the contents with the public. But I don't think it would be appropriate at this stage for me to share the content of it. I certainly can discuss constitutional reform, but I can't discuss the content of that report.
Are you satisfied with the process, the consultations process? Of course, as convener, the feedback and so on and contributions that you got.
Well, our terms of reference limited to a certain extent our ability to consult. We are not the Constitutional Reform Commission. Let me make that very clear. The five of us that met, we are not the Constitutional Reform Commission. We were merely a committee that was put together by the Prime Minister to advise him on areas for constitutional reform that a Constitutional Reform Commission would look at, to advise him on how a Constitutional Reform Commission should be comprised and set up, and areas where it should perhaps pay some greater attention, and also how it may wish to consider changing the Constitution. Because, as you know, there were a series of decisions coming out of the Constitutional Court, which was the Chief Justice in the last, up to recently, which dealt with constitutional issues, and a lot of those issues were controversial, for want of a better word.
Yes.
I don't want to be particularly unkind. And we've made recommendations as to how some of those matters, or changing the Constitution, should take place.
Okay, all right. You mentioned recommendations that were there before, and these recommendations were not implemented.
There are an awful lot of them.
Okay, a lot of them. Could we talk about if possibly some of those recommendations
Sure.
were implemented?
Sure.
Right. Let's talk about the recommendations and probably what position we would have been in by now. If I know you're not a mind reader, but we could talk about the recommendations.
I think the two most obvious recommendations that came out of the 1999 report on constitutional reform that have not been implemented, one of them is the Human Rights Commission.
Yeah.
Now, coming out of 1999, out of the 99 recommendations, and to a large extent embodied in the changed or amended Constitution, are some very progressive provisions. For example, treaties before. If a country entered into a treaty, any rights under that treaty that were purported to protect its citizens couldn't protect its citizens unless they passed what they call local legislation to do that. Under the amendments arising out of that process, there are certain treaties where their rights are automatically enforceable by the citizens without the necessity for domestic legislation. So torture, indigenous rights, etc., etc. There are a couple of treaties in Schedule 4. One of the major, or two, just to pick the obvious ones that came to light in the 10th Parliament, two areas where recommendations came and nothing was done. One of them was the Human Rights Commission, was never established, and the other one, of course, was the Public Procurement Commission. The Public Procurement Commission was recommended since 2001, 2002, never got established, and you remember there was a lot of debate and controversy during the 10th Parliament about that. The Human Rights Commission, which to me is particularly important because all the other commissions that had been set up, the Commission on Gender Equality, the Commission on Indigenous People, and various other commissions, child rights, that were set up, they were supposed to come under the umbrella Human Rights Commission.
Okay.
After 10 years, never established. As a matter of fact, 15 years, never established. And I think the citizens suffered as a result of the non-establishment. So when you say to me, where would we be had there been established, I shudder to think, because perhaps a lot of the difficulties we face today might have been addressed by that commission, and we would have had decisions and recommendations coming out of the Human Rights Commission about reform or about human rights, respecting human rights. And it hasn't happened. As a matter of fact, one of the experts we consulted with in our steering committee, Dr. Fenton Ramsey, I always remember one of the comments that he made is that we have not worked this present constitution enough to be able to make recommendations. And that's part of the challenge we have, because there were 171 recommendations which were made coming out of the last constitutional reform process. 85% of those have never been implemented. So when you ask us to make recommendations for the change of the Constitution, we can't even say that we should make a recommendation because we haven't even tried the bulk of the changes that were recommended previously. So it's like saying, hey, to improve this motor vehicle, you need to make these 18 changes. And you then come after that, and you haven't implemented those 18 changes, and you say, well, what recommendations do you make to the Constitution? Well, if you haven't even implemented the changes that were recommended before, it's difficult to come and say the Constitution needs these additional changes, because half the things we should have done, more than half, 80% of the things we should have done, we never did.
For clarity, just if I may jump in here, who implements the recommendations and who approves?
Well, a lot of those recommendations had to be implemented by the National Assembly.
Okay.
As you know, in the last Parliament, for the first time, we had the government of the day was a minority government, but the National Assembly was charged with doing it. And the Human Rights Commission, Public Procurement Commission, all of these things have to be established by the government of the day. They have to be funded. And there was marked reluctance on the part of the government of the day to establish the Public Procurement Commission. As you remember, they said that they wanted to make changes to what was recommended. They wanted Cabinet to have the final word. All these reasons were offered why it should be.
But in your experience, after these recommendations would have been made after consultations and the other processes and so on, would you recommend that additions or amendments still be made to recommendations?
Yes, there's certain areas. For example, like I said, we had a series of decisions coming out of the Constitutional Court, which was the Chief Justice, third term, various other decisions, which clearly indicate that there are areas. For example, the Chief Justice gave decisions on the operations of Parliament itself. Normally, under the separation of power, the judiciary doesn't get involved in what the legislature is doing, but the Chief Justice actually delivered decisions on how the Parliament should conduct its affairs, which we believe is problematic. So there are clear areas which clearly required, and I still think require, constitution change. Powers of the President, one of the very popular election mantras was reduction of the powers of the president. Who is the president accountable? How do you restructure the presidential powers? Immunities of the president. If you begin to strip the president of immunities, are there any protections? Can a lot of presidential decisions be subject to review by the courts? There are several areas. New legislation. Are we limited only to the government of the day presenting legislation to the House, or can a citizen, if a citizen thinks that there's an appropriate piece of legislation that could be presented, does that citizen have a right? So there are several areas, I think, in which we could make recommendations and did make recommendations about changing the Constitution so that it's modern and it's up to date. The Constitution is a living instrument. It's not something that's set in stone for the next 100 years. It has to take account of what is going on at the time.
Okay. While you're probably waiting on maybe another word from the PM on this matter, on constitutional reform. Of course, this is before we move on to another issue. And by the way, viewers, if you're now joining us, I'm talking to Mr. Nigel Hughes, and we're discussing constitutional reform. And this question is about, because I know you're very cautious and you're very careful with how you say certain things, sir. So this question is about you, Nigel Hughes, the person. What is your confidence level now that in this government, we will see these recommendations and changes and all of that regarding constitutional reform? What's your confidence level like?
That's a very unfortunate question because you're asking me to be candid, and my candor may put me in trouble. Let me say this. The Prime Minister asked us to make recommendations. I think that is an indication that there is some willingness on the part of the government of the day for them to consider the changes. Whether I think there's an appetite for the changes, personally, I think the jury is out on that. That's my view, is that the jury's out on that. I can't say that I have detected an appetite for constitutional change, but I'm hoping that I'm really wrong on that one. So that perhaps is as far as I would want to go at this stage.
On that. And as we're talking about the jury's out, before we move on to another, it has, in a sense, become a controversial topic for Guyanese because many agree, many disagree regarding we're dubbing it decriminalizing marijuana. However, Mr. Hughes has made it clear that his position is basically to reduce the penalties for it. But before we talk about that, sir, what is because you have, in the past, you have been very outspoken in certain things, which is fair enough. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion. The government has had the new government. We've had almost about, 7 months in office. What is your take on the new management of our country? And this is me asking you to be candid. How do you feel about the new management of our country, and do you believe that there are things that we can improve on and so on?
Malika, perhaps I should preface my response to that with a big disclaimer.
Okay.
Which is that I am responding to you as Nigel Hughes,
Nigel Hughes.
citizen, ordinary person. I'm not speaking to you in any other capacity, and I don't purport to attempt to speak to you in any other capacity.
My viewers can live with that, and I can live with that.
It's okay. My personal view is that during the campaign and for the years leading up to the last election, it became very obvious to the country that we needed a new way of doing business. Not just a new way, not just a new government, but clearly the way in which we ran our business, or the business of the country, the way in which we conducted ourselves, the way in which we related to each other required a transformational change. So it wasn't just during the election period and certainly before, we were just, my interpretation is that we were not just calling for a change in the government. We were calling in for transformational change in the way in which the country was run, our structures, the way we manage ourselves, our relations between the races, relations between the sexes, forward-looking, just how we see Guyana and how we take it forward. Newness, change. I think a lot of people from across the political divide and across the racial divide, across the ethnic divide, religious divide, wanted that because Guyana had been held back for so long because of perceived differences between its citizens, and we really needed a new approach. I will start off by saying 7 months is an extremely short period of time, and I didn't anticipate revolutionary change in 7 months. Having said that, however, I don't get the sense, speaking as an outsider, because I'm not in the government, I'm not in their deliberations, I'm not party to their deliberations, and there's no communication between the APNU and the AFC that I'm aware of outside of the ministers and cabinet. So I'm not aware of that going on. Okay. But what I will say is that spirit of change and the disposition to tackle the real issues of change and project a new Guyana in which everybody feels part, I think that has not been visible. What we have seen is Guyana beginning to become normal like any other country. So, for example, there are a lot of people saying, oh my God, can you believe how beautiful the capital city is? Look how clean it is. That's fine. But for me, in this day and age, cleanliness is not something you applaud. It's a human right. You have a human right to live in a city that is clean and that is cleaned regularly. And we shouldn't be sitting down in shock and awe that, oh my God, the city, the drains are flowing or we don't flood. But because we have not been there for so long, we're in shock for what is normal for everybody else. So Guyana has to get, as a country, has to get up to speed and understand that this is normal. What we really have not been doing is saying, how do we transform this country with these resources, with the people it has? What is our vision for really changing the future? A lot of that is technology. We have the most expensive internet, just to pick an obvious area
that everybody can identify with.
How do we get our young people involved? And that's for me personally, again, one of the biggest disappointments. The two. Very few young people have been appointed to decision-making positions. Very few. If you look at the cabinet, I think the cabinet, the youngest person must be 50 years old, or close enough to 50. Good. Very few women have been appointed. And here's the contradiction in that, just in the data. More women are being qualified than men, university, high school, wherever. They're getting better grades, and more of them numerically are qualifying. So the obvious result of that is that clearly if you were looking for, quote unquote, where the intelligence resides between the sexes, just under the graduation numbers, you would think
you should see more women in
absolutely.
The positions you're talking about.
But the exact flip side of that is reflected in the decision-making positions, which seems to suggest that even though all these women are beating the men or producing more than the men, they're coming out of school with better grades, coming out of university with better grades, we are not going to the obvious source of capability, obvious source of competency, and saying, come, put your skills that you clearly have demonstrated you have in a decision-making position.
If I can play devil's advocate here, let's say I come to you with the argument that, yes, we have the women, they're going to school and so on, but they're not
just going to school.
experienced.
This has been, hold on. This phenomena is not 5 years old. If you go back into the CXC records, you go back into the tertiary level records, women have been dominating from tertiary all the way through the educational system for in excess of 15 to 20 years. So if you left school 15 years ago and you were 18, even if you were 15, you are now 30. So it's not as if this is a recent phenomenon. So I don't subscribe to the argument that, this is a recent...
Okay, fine. Since you're right. There are many people who would not subscribe to that argument, as I said, devil's advocate. But then what really is our problem in Guyana? Because we have been seeing this, we don't have a problem.
No. When I say no, not that we don't have a problem, we seem to have, let me say, a reluctance to
don't we have enough confidence in our women and our youth?
I don't know who the we is, because I don't
Society.
appoint anyway. Well, I don't even blame society. I mean, women have just not been appointed. Whoever is responsible for appointing them is the person whom that question should be directed to.
All right.
I can't say we as a society.
I'll definitely take that, and we trust that it gets better, because your sentiments, they're obvious, they're plain as day, especially as it relates, because I've had this discussion with persons on this program before, especially it relates to women and the youth involvement. Now, let's move on to the other controversial topic. You have recommended, and you can correct me if I'm using the wrong words here, to reducing the penalties for marijuana. Now, my question to you is, what would you say to maybe a mother, a father, a family who would say to you that they've had bad experiences, especially where their children, and this is a social aspect of it, where their children got caught up in it and they're blaming the use of marijuana for their destruction. And to reduce the penalties would mean not easier access, but I would be a little more confident or braver to go do what I have to do with marijuana. What would you say to somebody who would come to you with that argument?
I'll respond to that, but I just wanted to correct something that you said, which is so not correct. That sounds terribly presumptuous. I just want to change something you said. There's nothing controversial about the sentence of 3 years for 15 grams of cannabis. I have not heard a single person, those who are in favor of decriminalization or those who are against it, say that it is acceptable in today's society to send somebody to prison for 3 years for 15 grams of cannabis. That's where we are today. And if there is no objection to that, the proposed legislation that we have doesn't deal with making it legal, does not deal with whether or not school kids are going to be sold narcotics. It simply says that this penalty that we have today is harsh, it's draconian, and everybody, as far as I know, I've not heard one person say up to date, that you should go to prison for 15 grams and go to prison for 3 years for 15 grams. The question you're asking me is whether prison operates as a deterrent to somebody's child who is either addicted to cannabis or addicted to some form of substance. No. This discussion for me needs to be driven by data rather than emotion, because everybody has emotional views.
Yeah.
And I can't say to you, Malika, if you have a son who is addicted to cannabis, that you should do X, Y, and Z. We need to look where the data is. I think most of the people who are substance addicted are addicted to real hardcore drugs. It's not a marijuana issue. So we need to go and see what the figures say on that, first of all. 2, imprisonment is not a deterrent per se, or imprisonment for 3 years is not a deterrent that if you remove it, if for small amounts, that all of a sudden tomorrow you're going to have a whole set of people lighting up and becoming addicted. Because again, you have to go to the science.
And in all fairness, I think some of us are running away with that. Because when you think about it, that's what you're getting.
What we see, and this is what's happening in Guyana, we see the social carnage because we see, quote unquote, all these junkies on the road, they're cleaning your car, they're harassing you. Those people are addicted to serious narcotics. They're addicted to cocaine, ecstasy, whatever, and they haven't necessarily got there as a result of using cannabis. Mm-hmm. So we are saying the whole discussion about the decriminalization of cannabis, you should consult with the society. What we're saying is what everybody has agreed to, but nobody wants to accept, which is putting somebody in prison for 3 years for 15 grams of cannabis is unacceptable. Locking up somebody for 3 years because they have smoking utensils for cannabis is crazy. Mr. Butts, who triggered this recent discussion, mm-hmm. had a coconut shell that had been converted for the purposes of smoking cannabis. Now, if you're telling me that this person should go to prison for 3 years because they got a converted coconut shell, then we're in bad waters. So I'm glad you've afforded me the opportunity to say that the legislation that is being proposed has nothing to do with whether or not cannabis becomes legalized.
Okay.
It simply says that the present penalties are harsh and draconian, and I have not heard a single person say that it's acceptable to jail somebody for 15 grams for 3 years. Now, we can dispute as to whether you go to 100 grams, 200 grams. What I will say to you in Trinidad, mm-hmm. you're allowed to have up to a kilogram of cannabis before it is deemed trafficking.
Okay.
So that really is
thank you for clearing that up, because I keep saying sometimes it's unfortunate. Our public needs to get back into reading details. We've gone into this mode where we read headlines and we draw conclusions. And the fact is, because I've heard people saying, what's wrong with Nigel Hughes, what's wrong with the president, because using their own, whether they agree or disagree with who said what, and it came over as though we're saying, the majority are saying, we want marijuana to be decriminalized completely, and families have a big problem with that.
No, not at all. I haven't advocated that. Certainly not the position of the people who have drafted it. Mm-hmm. And what I will say is, decriminalization of cannabis should have wide consultation. The society has to deal with that. But this is a simple sentencing matter, and Nigel Hughes is not advocating anything here. I got into this purely by accident. Mr. Butts got arrested. Mr. Waldron called me and said, "Can you help?" And I said, "No problem, I'll come forward to help." We drafted some legislation so that we can expedite the process. People have translated that to mean that I'm somehow advocating. No, I'm not. I got into this by accident, and quite frankly, I have already done what I think could be done for this. I no longer have an interest in it. I have drafted the legislation. We've put it there. It's up to the society. If they accept it, they accept it. If they don't, they don't. This is not an advocacy thing for me. There's nothing more that I wish to contribute on this. It's entirely up to the society whether they wish to go for it. So this is not a Nigel Hughes issue. This is not me going to Mr. Butts. Mr. Butts came and asked for some help. I did that. And really just divorce me from the issue and go ahead. You decide what you want to do. If you think it's okay to lock up people for 3 years, no problem.
Okay,
sir. It's out there for you,
Thank
too.
you so much for your clarity, your input on constitutional reform, your input on the marijuana issue, and of course your candid view on where we are as it related to governance. It was really a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much.
Viewers, of course, you were watching and listening and hearing a lot from Mr. Nigel Hughes. He is an executive in the Alliance for Change. He's an attorney at law, and he is also convener of the steering committee on constitutional reform. Of course, initially that's what we had him on this program today to discuss. This is Facing the Nation. When I come back, we'll take a quick break. When I come back, it will be time to wrap up today's program. Stay tuned. Thanks for staying tuned. And fortunately or unfortunately, this is that time of the program where I have to say goodbye for this week. I want to thank both guests for coming today. It was certainly very informative. Mr. Khemraj Parsram, he's the Director of Compliance and Enforcement at the Environmental Protection Agency. He talked to us about the pending, well, not pending, the styrofoam ban and basically the protection of our environment. We also had Mr. Nigel Hughes, who I just wrapped up the conversation with on constitutional reform and some other matters that he made, expressed some sentiments on and so forth. So I'd like to thank both gentlemen for coming today. And as always, thank you very much for tuning in. I know you missed the phone lines, but I will try in the coming weeks to open up the phone lines and have you call and air your grievances and get some answers from some of our government officials who would come on this program from time to time. However, for next week, one of the things we're going to be discussing next week is of course, as you know, there has been the what you call restructuring in a sense. We brought back, the current government brought back the Guyana People's Militia. So I hope to have someone from there talking about the Guyana People's Militia, the importance of it, and how Guyanese can benefit from that on next week's program. This is where I have to say bye-bye. For now, I am Malika Ramsey, as always, reminding you to be good Guyanese citizens, take care of yourselves, and take care of each other. Goodbye.